You're weird. We look We'll just give it a couple more minutes. We've got Kate, Lloyd, Alan. I'm just looking down the list at the moment. So we will just see if any others join us, but we have a comprehensive slide deck, so I will get it underway fairly quickly. All right, so we will just kick off because, as I say, we probably will fill the hour, and there's another briefing on at 4. So thanks, Alan, Kate, and Lloyd for joining us. We may be joined by others as their afternoon commitments permits, and as you can see, we have an array of staff to support this process. So there are plenty of chance to ask questions over the various aspects of our business that the wastewater standards touch on. So what we thought was helpful, we know wastewater is a hot topic for a number of reasons at the moment, but the proposed wastewater standards from Te Mata Arawai will have implications for us as a regulator, but just in terms of our role in setting policy and then consenting and compliance off the back of it. There is a submission process underway that involves the submissions working group, but it is an area of interest to the whole of council. So we thought a briefing to understand what those proposed standards were and what they would mean within Otago would be helpful. And that obviously gives us a chance to collect some or answer some questions, but also collect some thoughts to put in the mix for that submission that we have to make. So I'm just going to hand over to Fleur, who will lead this with some other staff, and I don't know, maybe Tom DP is going to lead it, but they'll sort it out between the two of them. And yeah, I think I'd just encourage you to ask questions, because again, as per these online sessions, that's really what the purpose of these are. And then we can try and get through the content by 4 o'clock. Over to you, Tom.
Kia ora. Thank you, Richard. So as Richard kind of explained, in February, Te Mata Arawai released a discussion document on proposed wastewater environmental performance standards. The purpose of today, sorry, I'm just trying to get on to the next slide. The purpose of today really is to give you a bit of a brief overview of the proposal, and also then to share with you our initial thoughts, and also provide you with an opportunity to give feedback and to ask some questions and to go into a discussion as well. The consultation period closes at the end of this month on the 24th of April. And as Richard explained, we've kind of sent around the proposal to the various teams within council, the science team, consents team, compliance team as well, and the consents administration team, and sought feedback from those teams. That feedback, together with the views from the likes of yourselves and perhaps other councillors, will be incorporated into a draft submission, which will then provide to the submissions working group, and we intend to lodge it at least by the 24th of April. The standards themselves, they are expected to be implemented or to be gazetted in the middle of the year or towards the end of the year. And the implementation of the national standards will happen through the consenting process. So what will happen is when new wastewater treatment plants are established, they apply for a consent, and the standards will be included or will be implemented through consent conditions. For existing wastewater infrastructure, they will be implemented when their existing consents come up for renewal. There's a few key drivers behind the proposal. First of all, New Zealand government wants to actually protect the health of our communities and our environment. But obviously, there's also a desire to achieve some efficiencies in terms of cost and time. Certainty and clarity around the goalposts for wastewater infrastructure actually will provide the operators with more certainty, and it will help them actually with their budgetary planning. Also, clarity around the goalpost is intended to make the consenting process easier and quicker and therefore cheaper. So it will have actually also benefits for consenting authorities as well as applicants as well. Now, before we get into the detail of the proposal, it might be useful to just explain what is the scope of it. So what's included or covered by the standards and what isn't. So the standards try to come up with a nationally consistent set of limits for discharges of some key contaminants to water and to land. They also include standards for the beneficial reuse of biosolids, and they set standards for the management of overflows and the operation of bypasses. And I will explain later on in the presentation what biosolids are and what we mean with overflows and bypasses. It's important to note that the standards, as they are currently proposed, only really apply to public wastewater infrastructure networks. So networks that are run by councils or council-owned and operated organizations. They don't cover community-owned or private networks. There aren't too many around, but it is something that is definitely being contemplated, I think even in the Dunedin area for some of the developments that are in the works. I think probably around Doctor's Point, that is a possibility. Also, they do not cover on-site private systems, so septic tanks are not covered by them. Wastewater plants often have a component that requires need for discharges to air consents. That aspect is also not covered by the standards. And as I said before, the standards, they focus on some key contaminants, but they do not include, for example, heavy metals or PFAS, which are synthetics that are often used in carpets or in kitchenware. Also, they do not cover recycled treated wastewater for non-potable use. There's also some key principles that cover all the different standards. So under the standards, TAs remain responsible for any decision-making around wastewater infrastructure. So they really decide where they're going to locate and how they're going to manage their plants and all the associated infrastructure. Regional councils, they will remain responsible for the consenting, the monitoring, compliance, and the enforcement of the standards. But it's important to note that the standards are actually absolute. So what that means is that regional councils, they cannot set consent decisions that would lead to more stringent or less stringent standards. So we really have to stick with the standards as they are proposed now. It's also important to note that for some activities, the standards set a permitted activity rule. And if that's the case, and the permitted activity conditions are being met, we cannot require that activity to be consented under a regional plan. And a final important point to make is that if all the standards are being met, we have to grant a 35-year consent for that activity. So it's probably, before we dive into the more detailed aspects, it's probably a good point to kind of pause here a little bit and to share with you our initial reflections on those key drivers and the scope and some of those overarching principles. We think that the intent behind the proposal definitely makes sense, but there is some scope for refinement. And one of the key concerns that we have is around the absolute nature of the standards. And we consider that there would be some benefit in having standards that allow us to set bespoke standards. The standards as they are now, while they do consider various categories of receiving water bodies or environments, they do not allow us to take all local environmental conditions into account. And also, often with a lot of the planning, we start from community aspirations and mana whenua aspirations. And in this case, that's almost impossible to do. The standards are what they are. And where there is tension between what the community wants and the standards, that could possibly lead to some problems. Also, we consider that bespoke standards might be needed where the community wants us to improve the health of receiving environments as well. So instead of having absolute standards, we think it might be sensible for the government to have the standards as default standards or minimum standards. Also, we consider that it would be sensible to provide regional councils with some flexibility to set consent terms that are less than 35 years. There might be a number of plants that are situated in very sensitive environments, and it might be more appropriate to set a consent that is more transitional in nature rather than allow for those 35-year consents. And then there's also concerns around fairness. And what I mean with that is, first of all, if there is a situation where we want to address degradation, the question will arise, well, if the standards are what they are, does that mean that other resource users or other people or organizations or businesses that discharge contaminants, will they be required to reduce their discharges or the impacts? Also, I think the distinction between public and private networks, especially when they're of the same scale, is something that is probably worthwhile thinking about as well, given that some of those private infrastructure might be vested later on into council. So those are some initial thoughts from staff. Are there any questions at this point, or shall I just continue?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
It'd be just really helpful in a Otago context, rather, where would you see, if they're meeting the minimum standards required, can you give me an example of where you might say, actually, we wouldn't give 35 years? I think it'd be really helpful to understand where you're thinking on that context.
I don't have any specific examples in mind.
Okay. Classic example.
It's not meeting the standards, so that's the difference. I can understand it in the way.
But even if it was, would you have it going into a tidal wetland? Probably not.
Yeah, but I don't think it's going to meet those minimum standards. I would expect that it wouldn't meet the minimum standards, I suppose. And so, yeah, Okay, and but I get that, and I was thinking about that, and that's partly why I was asking that question. But how that, yeah, and how it translates. It'd be really helpful to have examples, just so that we're making sure we're all on the same page, really. Because I can see some instances where we might do something quite differently. Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
But it's definitely something that we can think about and possibly include in the draft submission.
Yeah. Is Dunedin seriously considering allowing a reticulated sewage at Doctor's Point being privately run?
It is something that might be contemplated, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I just qualify that to say that was part of a mediation agreement that we signed up to? So we need to be a little bit careful about that one.
Is it still not signed off?
Not signed off. It's been signed off for a couple of years.
And we accepted that as a potential option.
We pushed for a community scheme rather than individual wastewater systems. Yep.
But a private community scheme.
I thought it was being vested, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, I suggest now we kind of dive in a little bit more into the detail of the standards. There are 4 sets of standards, and the first one is actually discharges to water. And here, what we'll see is there's limits proposed, treatment limits proposed for a number of specific contaminants: ammonia, phosphorus, nitrogen, E. coli, total suspended solids, and biological oxygen demand. The limits do not apply uniformly across all water bodies. Basically, what the proposal provides for is 7 classes of water bodies based on their sensitivity and their ability to dilute pollutants. So to give you an example, for example, lakes are considered to be very sensitive, and they are treated with the most care. So there, the standards for those key contaminants will be more stringent than for other types of water bodies. On the other side of the spectrum, you've got open oceans, and open ocean has, probably the highest dilutive capacity. So there, the standards are the least stringent, and actually some contaminants are excluded from them. It only set standards in that environment for E. coli and ammonia. But the standards do not only set limits for contaminants, they also set out specific requirements for monitoring and reporting. The monitoring requirements apply at the end of the pipe, so not in the receiving environment at this stage. And they differ. So wastewater treatment plants that are bigger in size will be required to monitor more often than smaller ones. There's also a partial exemption for existing small wastewater treatment plants. I say existing because new ones or existing small wastewater treatment plants that are being upgraded to a bigger scale, they'll still need to meet the standards, so to speak. But the existing small wastewater treatment plants, what is proposed is to exempt them for nitrogen and phosphorus standards. And they're also consulting on relaxing other requirements, including the standards for E. coli. There's other exceptions to the standards. For example, the phosphorus and nitrogen limits do not apply in rocky or hard-bottom streams. And actually, that's a very common, if not the most common, stream type in Otago. And so in those cases, we would have to do still a site-specific risk assessment for those contaminants. The discharges do also not apply to pristine water bodies. Streams with very low dilution ratio, streams with naturally high levels of particulate matter, aquifers, and natural wetlands. Now, there's a little bit on clarity in the standards around what naturally high levels of a particular parameter means, and we'll probably ask for some more clarity on that in the standards or in the guidance. Also, when it comes to the term pristine water bodies, that is defined as meeting all the, meeting the A bands of all the attributes currently included in the NPSFM. So what we consider to be pristine water bodies in Otago, the majority of that, even the ones in the upper lakes, like the Dart River, would still not meet that threshold.
How do you define the natural wetlands then?
Natural wetlands would be, it's not defined in the standards, but I think the definition in the NPSFM would apply there, or in the regulations.
Or the RPS?
Yeah.
Which is fraught still.
Oh.
Okay.
No, you'd go to the legislative definition first.
Yeah.
Which needs to be consistent with.
Again, it's not clear in the standards specifically how these terms should be interpreted.
No, that's great. I know there's a question, so I haven't got my head around on the natural wetlands. Thank you.
Also, discharges to receive.
Lloyd had a question.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I can't. Tom, could you just, so these are exceptions, you said there's no P and N limits apply in rocky or hard bottom streams. Does that mean there's no limit as to how much phosphorus and nitrogen you can put in to those waterways?
My understanding is that it's basically up to the council to set limits based on a case-by-case basis, really, for those contaminants.
So they wouldn't be included in the formula, like the.
No.
Yeah, okay.
We do not need to apply the standards, the national standards in these cases.
Oh, I understand now. And you're thinking that may also relate to E. coli as well in those waterways.
I think perhaps Rachel or Mark can elaborate on that, but I think that the E. coli limits do still apply.
All about what we're talking about.
So the E. coli limits still apply.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just reading it wrong, so thanks for that clarification. Yep.
Also, discharges close to human drinking water intakes would be exempt, and also there would be alternative limits in certain water bodies to protect shellfish health as well. And my understanding is that would allow us to set more stringent requirements for E. coli and pathogens. So that was the first category of standard. The second category of standards are standards for discharges to land, and they're actually quite different. The process for determining those standards is quite different from discharges to water. Here, the standards propose to apply a risk-based approach that involves three components. So first, a desktop assessment needs to be made around the suitability of the topography, the geology, the surrounding land use, and the groundwater in the vicinity of the discharge point to see whether it's actually suitable. After that, there is a need for a qualitative risk screening assessment that looks at the pathways that contaminants would follow. And then finally, an even more detailed assessment is required, a site-specific assessment that looks again at soils and groundwater. The standards themselves are loading rates and limits for total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and E. coli. that are determined by combining the results from the risk and the site capability assessments. So it's quite a complex process to derive the appropriate limits, really. As is the case with discharges to water, the standards go beyond purely setting limits. They, again, include monitoring and reporting requirements. They also require that the infrastructure operators provide a management and an operation plan that sets out site inspections, site maintenance, and various contingency requirements. It's important to note that the standards only apply to low-rate infiltration systems, and I'll come back to that later on, and that they set maximum loading rates for application, where contaminants are not covered by the national standards. Regional council is still able to set limits or specific limits for those. So those contaminants are suspended solids and heavy metals and a range of other ones. So we've gone over the standards for water and land, and just to give you a little bit of an idea as to how many activities are affected by them. At the moment, we've got about 15 consented discharges of wastewater to freshwater and an equal amount of discharges to land. And then there's a small number of consents for discharges of wastewater to the coastal environment. When we actually look at how the impacts would impact, how the standards would impact on the performance of those plants, the results are a bit of a mixed bag. In some cases, the application of the national standards will actually improve the performance of the plants, and that's probably most likely to be the case in kind of older infrastructure. And in some cases, they actually drive a reduction in discharge quality as well. So that brings along actually a risk of degradation in some water bodies. And it's, probably something to keep in mind. As I said before, the standards, they actually are unlikely to provide a very good protection for some of our iconic waterways. And also the standards, as they are proposed, they have a single distributional statistic. And we consider that having a number of two different statistics, like, for example, a median and a 90th percentile as a limit, will actually be more effective in dealing with both short-term and long-term effects of contaminant discharges.
Michael?
Thank you. I'd like some, not examples, but the list against those bullet points. Do you have that?
I do, yes, yeah. So
you don't need to do it now, but I guess, can you email that to us consequent to this meeting?
Well, sorry, the list of consented discharges, or
No, you've got 4 bullet points here.
Saying
what the results will be. So what I'm looking for is the detail of, for example, which are the plants that would be improved, what are the water bodies that you consider as more likely to be degraded, and why, and then the iconic waterways to which you say the exceptions don't apply. So some definition around those, please.
Yeah. I'm looking at our science team, whether some of those, whether we actually already have done some work in that area.
Well, I mean, you wouldn't have them up as bullet points, surely, unless you had
We'll take that away, Michael, and when we send something back, we will also articulate the sort of level of confidence in terms of, based on what we know, given their proposed standards, we can apply with a level of confidence some assessments to existing plants that are consented. So leave that with us. I understand what you're asking for there.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So those are some reflections with regard to the proposed standards for discharges to water. When it comes to discharges to land, one or some of the matters or issues that have arisen there is that the standards do not provide for some of the soil types that are more common in Otago, specifically soil types where you've got low assimilation capacity. And they also do not provide for rapid infiltration beds, which is quite a common practice in central Otago, is my understanding. It's also hard to fully assess the standards because certain aspects of the risk-based approach that I just presented a few slides ago, like the detail is not really known. For example, the risk screening assessment tool is not yet available, it hasn't been developed yet. We do know that the restriction, the application restrictions, they have or may have some consequences in a number of cases where treatment plants may actually be required to put in more extra storage as well. So unless there's any more questions around that, I might move on to the third category of...
Yes, if I can butt in with a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so look, just thinking about the discharges to water and discharges to land, if local authority somewhere is planning a new plant, whose decision then is it around those two options of land and water? I mean, if they can show that their land site will meet those conditions and their water site will meet those conditions, is that entirely up to the local authority who is establishing that to decide whether to go down the discharge to water or the discharge to land pathway?
My understanding is that that is the case. They have an option basically, or they have options in that regard. They just need to meet either of those standards, yeah.
Right, okay. And we know that Mana Whenua have a clear preference on that one. Is there any scope for that preference having an influence on the decision in this proposed framework?
Well, I think that's basically a discussion that the operator then needs to have with Mana Whenua. But you do raise a point, and it is something that I mentioned at the start as well, like they don't allow for certain community or Mana Whenua aspirations to be fully accounted for.
Yeah, okay.
I think, Alan, the conversation I've heard on these in some forums is that they are setting more consistent standards in terms of the regulation of these plants, but it wouldn't stop a TA or a treatment plant operator from going above and beyond those standards based on the outcome of conversations with their community and Mana Whenua partners. But our role as a regulator is going to be limited by the standards that they bring in.
Yes, yep, no, thank you, understand that. And look, just also to, thank you, follow up on one thing we were talking about earlier. Tom, you noted that those P&N limits will not apply to rocky streams, but you did seem to suggest we could still apply them if we chose. Is that really going to be an option, or if they sees if that's the exception, they don't apply, then they don't apply? Is that clear?
My understanding is that we can set limits for those contaminants.
Right, okay.
It would just not be a standard limit. It would be based on on a case-by-case basis, and determined through the normal resource consent process.
Okay, thank you.
Michael?
So let's try Central Otago as an example. They were concerned at the cost of land treatment of their wastewater treatment plant, or their new one, the existing one, and the one they intend to upgrade. Do these water standards now mean that they will not be required to discharge to land so long as they fit these other conditions?
My understanding is that's correct. As long as they meet the standards for discharges to water, they can continue discharging to water as opposed to land.
Yeah, what I was just going to say is the choice is still theirs, Michael. It's just whichever choice they go, they'll have a different.
I understand that, but just they're not like to wish to spend an extra $55 million. So I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Okay. On to the third category and of standards. Those are standards basically around the reuse of biosolids. Biosolids are basically a nutrient-rich byproduct of wastewater. They're called solids, but sometimes the degree of solids within that matter is actually very limited, and they more qualify as sludge. But they contain a wide variety often of contaminants, nitrogen and phosphorus, but in some cases zinc, copper, magnesium, and various other substances like macroplastics, chemicals, heavy metals. They can have a beneficial use, for example, in improving the soil condition, if they're treated appropriately and if they're well managed. The standards that are proposed are actually based on existing guidelines that actually have been used by the sector for quite a wee while. And basically, what the national standards propose is that the biosolids are classified using a matrix and kind of classified based on the level of pathogen content that is in them and the level of metals or other contaminants, organic contaminants in them. So, for example, if a biosolid has very low levels of E. coli and very low levels of other contaminants, they might be permitted. The disposal of that matter might be permitted under the national under the national standards. If the levels of contaminants are more elevated, it could become controlled or restricted discretionary activity. Where there is no grade prescribed by the standards, we can still assess the management of biosolids through our normal consenting process. Again, there's monitoring and reporting requirements. The standards also set a maximum application rate of 200 kilograms per hectare per year. And even though the standards do not deal with the managers or do not prescribe the management of contaminants of emerging concern, like heavy metals and PFAS, the consultation document still seeks feedback on how Tamata Arawai can provide guidance on the short-term management of those contaminants. I was going to say as well that if, for example, biosolids contain quite a lot of pathogens still. There's certain restrictions that are prescribed by the standards, and those are often restrictions in terms of public access to the disposal area. At the moment, there's actually no known instances of beneficial reuse of biosolids in Otago. Often, or in most cases, we simply dispose of them at a landfill. The Tahuna wastewater plant, I believe, has an incinerator as well. So that's another way of getting rid of biosolids. One thing that as staff we picked up on is the maximum application rate that is proposed is not in line with current best practice, and it could actually result in an oversupply of phosphorus on disposal fields. And also, yeah, with the permitted activity status, we think it's worthwhile thinking about that as well, because actually what we found, if we can draw a comparison with like old landfills, for example, we often don't know what's in these landfills or where they are located. Having a permitted activity status for the disposal of biosolids on the long term could put us in a position where we are dealing with a situation where we don't know where specific contaminants have been disposed of, especially in light of the fact that those biosolids contain a wide range of contaminants. And some of the knowledge and the science behind the impacts of those contaminants on the environment and on public health is still not fully known. So a controlled activity status or restricted discretionary is probably more appropriate in that regard. Councillor Wilson?
I'm just checking in about fine to do incinerator, except for the location. And I think you said that something about there's no restrictions on air. And I'm just checking. I mean, the one at Tahuna at times I think isn't particularly well liked. I may have that wrong. Because of the incinerator and the air quality. So I'm just checking what I think you said on the first slide, but I don't think we've got the slides to check. You said something about there's nothing in this for.
Yeah, so the standards do not deal with the discharges to air from wastewater treatment.
So our plan would deal with the air.
Correct, yeah.
And we could restrict it on that. Thank you, just checking.
Yeah, it is important to kind of note that when you read the consultation document, it's implied that this is a first set of standards. It's very likely that more standards for different activities will follow. And it's one thing they seek feedback on, like what should a second set of national standards include? Should it include standards for septic tanks, or it could be discharges? It's something that you could, provide feedback on.
Thank you.
Councillor Gallagher?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Just on what you're recommending is that there wouldn't be a permitted activity status for the application of biosolids per hectare. But is that because we don't like the 200 kgs per hectare? And would there be a lesser application rate per hectare where we would say, well, actually, this could fit within a permitted activity rule? Because if you look at the overall volume and the fact that that is going to what is basically landfill and waste at the moment, but if there was a far lesser application rate per hectare, then wouldn't that be a better way for Otago to reuse biosolids?
Yeah, look, our thinking is still kind of developing in this area. It might be that a permitted activity rule that is more refined and that considers, that considers the receipt or allows for consideration of the receiving environment, that it is actually appropriate. It might be that a notification requirement as well to council could help us addressing some of the concerns. We're still trying to get our head around the proposal. So definitely food for thought.
Tom, can I just butt in there, please?
Yeah.
I think the rationale is more around the other contaminants and the heavy metals, and the point that you made that unless we know where these particular places are, then you lose some control over the, I guess, regional perspective around what loads have been impacting in certain catchments. And it's not really based around the total TN application rate. It's more about that holistic, Councillor Keller, around that other contaminants included, and in particular also phosphate. With the TN application rate of 200 in certain vulnerable classes of soils, which Otago predominates, particularly in central Otago, you're actually supplying a greater amount of phosphate required than what is required for agronomic conditions. And those then have implications for contaminant loads within the environment and in waterways. I hope that sort of adds a little bit more.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay. Any more questions around that? No. And then I might move on to the last set of standards. They apply to overflows and bypasses. And most of you will know what an overflow is. It's basically untreated or partially treated wastewater that kind of escapes the network. It's a danger for the public and for the environment as well, can have some impacts there. But it can be caused by various factors. People often refer to dry weather overflows and wet weather overflows. Dry weather overflows is where you've got plant failures or blockages. Wet weather overflows are more are instances where there's an overflow as a result of high inflows or infiltration due to excessive rainfall. But on the whole, it's likely to become more of a problem in the future due to the changing climate as well. A bypass is an infrastructure component that allows that partially treated wastewater to be diverted past the normal route to the plant and discharged to the environment. So it's a kind of like bit of infrastructure that allows us to a certain extent to control the overflow and control where it happens. The standards propose that all existing overflow and bypasses are becoming assessed as a controlled activity. Again, there's some monitoring and reporting requirements. And it also requires operators to develop and implement wastewater risk management plans. At the moment in Otago, there's only one consented overflow. And in our current plan, as is the case actually with biosolids, we don't have really a framework to manage this kind of activity. On the whole, we are supportive of a consenting framework for overflows. Some people want it to be prohibited, but actually a prohibition would not prevent them from occurring. Whereas if you consented, the operators, the network operators, are actually required to think more carefully as to how they're going to manage these situations. So it's actually probably a better way of managing these things. However, we do recommend a different activity status. So not controlled and also not permitted. there might be instances, for example, where we want to decline an application for an overflow. That might be the case in a situation where, for example, a plant where it's possible to direct overflows towards less sensitive water bodies that are in the vicinity of the plant. Also, as a staff, we consider that we should try to make sure that wet weather overflows are minimized for new systems, but also make sure that dry weather overflows are minimized for all systems. That is because all infrastructure should actually try their hardest to avoid the risk of overflow in terms of plant failure or the likes.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yes.
So, I think I'm possibly overthinking this, but an overflow could be into a bund as a redundancy, or so. What is driving us to contain any overflow, so that it can't discharge into, say, a waterway, but may discharge onto a land into a bund? And I just want to check. So be careful how that's considered. An overflow that went to a bund might be an appropriate resilience step, because these things are, mistakes happen or things don't work, and building capacity to have a bund in there as opposed to an uncontained discharge.
It's probably in a case where an overflow is directed to a bund, it may not even qualify as an overflow, because it's not to a water body or natural water body as such. But it comes back to that point that we think we should try to minimize the risk of dry weather overflows, especially, like where we would encourage plants to actually provide for those bunds.
And it is making sure that there is a safety net. If you've got a petrol bowser, you've got that bund. And you need to know how to empty that bund.
That is something that is something that needs to be covered as well, or should be covered in those risk management plans.
Eric?
Thank you. But just on that, we would have to be within the realms of reality, though, wouldn't we? Because if we got too carried away from an engineering perspective and what we might require, you could end up having the cost of a plant plus the cost of a plant, maybe plus the cost of another plant, because we get to a level of zealousness that we don't want any overflow whatsoever. Whereas this is infrastructure, it will break down. There needs to be somewhere for this stuff to go. Because I look at the Wanaka one as an example, which looks to be absolutely state of the art, but then it's way up on a hill, surrounded in farmland. What happens if the worst case scenario for that plant happens? That these systems are a river; they are flowing constantly. They need to be able to go somewhere while they rapidly repair or protect their infrastructure so they can get back online again. So I suppose it's not really a question, maybe it's more a concern, that if we look to be too concerned, we could double the cost of these plants, if not more.
But I mean, it comes back to, what I said at the start, like it's probably something that we cannot avoid. There's probably appropriate as well to apply a degree of pragmatism around that. Just keep on encouraging actions or strategies.
Tom, can I help? Can I help a little bit here? Having visited a number of wastewater treatment plants in the last 2 weeks, so the issue around overflows for most of those small rural communities is that the the overflow or the bypass, they bypass what's considered the primary treatment. So generally you will see trickling filters or the big tanks with stones, and those treatments are bypassed by the overflow and bypass, so the effluent with all the stormwater, and they go straight into generally the oxidation ponds. So what that then means is, so to Councillor Wilson's concerns, most of those overflows are pushed into some form of pond system. The fact is, though, what happens then is the retention time of those ponds for the human sewage is reduced markedly, and so therefore the quality of outflow into the river or stream or whatever is a lot higher. So there is a form of containment, and even in the Wanaka wastewater treatment plant, which I saw last week, and those discussions, what generally happens is there's always a pinch point, Councillor Kelleher, where and in that case, it's how much sludge that they can remove, and it's removed, I think, daily as they decant off the big tanks and decant through their filtration and UV light systems before they put out into the beds. Generally, it means that they lose the control of the process, and therefore it's a higher contaminant load. It's not raw sewage pumping straight into water. It's generally still some form of minimal treatment, but with a higher contaminant load. So that is the reality. The expectation, and I understand about the costs, Councillor Keller, the expectation would be that they'd have risk management strategies. And if the key one is looking at reducing the stormwater inflows, and a lot of that is from in the reticulated network, having houses that are putting all their stormwater into the effluent as well. So there is some TAs are looking at that, but I guess that's sort of part of the risk management and where you put bang for your buck. I hope that helps in the understanding.
And Tom, just conscious of time, you've probably got 90 seconds left.
We've gone through the entire presentation. I only had one slide, I think, with some key questions, which I've accidentally skipped now. But they're basically, are the limits appropriate? Are the exceptions appropriate? What should the future standards focus on? And other things like climate change, population growth, and etc. Should that be included or considered when it comes to consent terms, setting consent terms? Councillor Wilson?
Thank you. I think, look, yes, we have to worry about the environment. Yes, we have to worry about intergenerational costs, but we also have to be fiscally minded. You can set up all of these schemes for failure if they are just too expensive. And we've seen it come through time and time again with people trying to do the best thing, go novel, or because they're trying to save costs because they become so expensive, and I put Queenstown in there. Look at our Karoa, trying desperately to get away from a important site, but it's causing, I think they were quoting something like $100,000 per ratepayer. We need to be fiscally orientated, otherwise we'll have other rules put upon us. And so we just have to be, slightly realistic on cost drivers here.
Yeah, that's noted.
So just to wrap up, Tom, can you just remind the councillors on the call what opportunity they've got to feed into, because I think this closes just off the back of the Easter week or Easter Anzac week.
Yeah. So the process that we're working towards is basically to get a draft of the submission ready this week. And hopefully we can then distribute that to the members of the council's submission working group. So that would, yeah, leave quite a bit of time before the actual submission date. I suggest perhaps that other councillors that are not part of the submissions working group get in touch with the working group members.
Yeah, remind us who's on that group.
It's Councillor Wilson, Councillor McCall, Councillor Weir, and Councillor, sorry,
Noon is the
Councillor
other.
Noon.
All right, so there's an opportunity for that group to engage with other councillors, and also if there were any other thoughts based on today's presentation, they can just be emailed through to you in the first instance, Tom.
That would be great, yeah. And happy to kind of share the presentation as well and some background material with either the submissions working group or the wider council.
Yeah. And then we've got that takeaway, that action from the question from Michael on slide 13, was just those that sort of cursory assessment we did on what the proposed standards would mean for the existing consented treatment plants.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, any final questions from those councillors online?
No, not for me. Thanks very much. But yeah, I think I'll just email in some feedback.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.
No, I'm all happy, Richard. I just wonder whether it might be one that we could send the submission to all councillors in the first instance, but have it discussed in the submission working group one.
All good from me. Thanks, team.
Okay, thanks, Alexa. We'll take that away, Lloyd. I'll have a chat to the team and the submissions group and just make sure we follow a good process for it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Tom, for that.
Thank you.
Carrying the load for that one, and Mark for your inputs as well. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.